Thing here. So we'll go ahead and get started, and then there may be some other folks that will join us shortly. Tonight we are looking at or talking about the structure of the Anglican Communion. That is how it kind of assembles itself, how it's put together, how it governs itself, what it thinks about itself. Um, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And that's what I want. So you should see a PowerPoint that's got a bunch of little dots on it and
Yep.
some very fancy lettering there and a yellow border. Um, and doing it this way, I think last time I said, we're trying to kind of go through this course, Anglican ethos and spirituality and structure. It's kind of a chronological thing. And the way we're doing it or approaching it, it actually is making it so that the last time we gathered, we were talking about the prehistory of the Anglican Communion, the Church of England, and then what became the Anglican Communion. So we looked at that prehistory from around 200 AD, the arrival of Christianity in Britain, through the Protestant Reformations of the 16th century. And what we're doing tonight is we're really jumping ahead about 400 years from the beginning of the Church of England, the reforms that Henry VIII initiated with Thomas Cranmer and the other English reformers. We're skipping like 400 years almost. Well, really 300, I guess. We're going to the 1860s first and then to the 1960s. And we're doing that because General Convention is next week. And kind of from the beginning of this course, we talked about how nice it would be to have this sort of coincide with what happens at General Convention. And that may come out more in the discussion than what we're talking about in this part of the conversation tonight. Um, but it is a good opportunity to kind of have a refresher before some of us head to Louisville. And for those of us who aren't heading to Louisville, before some of us no doubt join online to watch all of the legislative excitement and everything
Yes.
that
Okay.
happens at General Convention. Um, so when we talk about the Anglican Communion, we are talking about a fellowship or communion of autonomous Christian churches united by a common history, confessing a common faith, and traditionally holding to a common liturgy. The word traditionally is inserted there in front of liturgy because for many provinces of the Anglican Communion, they no longer use the Book of Common Prayer as it's been passed down to us. That is the historic Book of Common Prayer. The one that really held sway was the 1662 version. That is still kind of legally, technically, the official Book of Common Prayer in places like the United Kingdom, the Anglican Church of Canada, I'm sure other provinces as well. But they have created supplementary texts to go along with that. So I think the one in England is called Common Worship. There may be another one. Sorry, I'm looking at my shelf. I can't remember what they're all called. There may be another one that was developed after that. The liturgy in Canada has its own name. In America, we did a fairly substantial revision of the Book of Common Prayer, but instead of giving it a new name, we just kept calling it the Book of Common Prayer. And so kind of that definition has a little bit of fuzziness to it. But the fuzziness is really part and parcel with what it means to be Anglican in general. So that's not exactly a bad thing. Um, the uh, the communion itself is made up of 38 distinct and independent Anglican churches. which are called provinces. You'll note that in the American Episcopal Church, we also have provinces as well as a way of dividing up the country, figuring out which section of America we're talking about. Or some of those are missionary provinces, so they would lie outside of the United States proper. And I'm mentioning that just because it's easy to find these confusions in terms. But when we talk about provinces in terms of the Anglican Communion, we're talking about nations that are effectively their own province, or provinces that are made up of several different countries. So if you look on that map, there's a province down there of South Africa, and I'm sorry, my geography is not great. It's been a while since I've visited that region. But there's several countries that are part of this province in South Africa. And if I could find my, yeah, I probably can't. Oh well.
Sure.
Somewhere, sorry, I'm looking for my laser pointer option here, but I
Oh,
don't see it. Oh, there we go.
there you
So
are.
there's several countries that make up one province there. South America, you see the same thing. If they're color coded the same, then it means that they kind of form their own province, whereas Australia is its own province, right? Um, and so what that indicates is each of these 38 provinces are distinct and independent Anglican churches. Um, and so what that means for us is that when we talk about the Anglican Communion, we are speaking about a collective. It's not a unitary or monolithic Christian body. It is an associative group of Christian peoples who can trace their heritage in some way or another back to the kind of the elements that are mentioned in this definition. There's a common history. That means that they generally spring from the Church of England in some way, shape, or form. It either arrived there through colonialism or through missionary activity from churches that had previously been colonized by the English. Um, they have a common faith. So they're looking back to some of the things that we talked about the last time we gathered, towards the historic creeds, towards the scriptures, towards the things that are really fundamental for what it means to be Christian, and also things that would generally be shared across denominational or ecumenical lines. The common faith that we point to, we want to say yes, we would find that. The constituent elements of that in some way, shape, or form amongst Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Presbyterian, Baptist, whatever it is, there should be an expectation that that would show up in some way or another in those places. For discussions of the Anglican Communion, that common faith takes on specifically Anglican ideals. Is really the subject of this course, and then a common liturgy, which, like I said, it references typically the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, because that is the book that endured the longest in the most places. Um, so, since it's a communion of churches rather than a monolithic church, that gives it a fairly distinct characteristic, in that it wishes to act in harmony with itself. It wants to maintain relationships with itself. And it also wants to maintain ecumenical and interfaith relationships beyond the body. And it's going to share similar systems of faith and practice. But the question is, and this is really what we're exploring tonight, how it does that. If we think about the Roman Church, the way in which it does that, it comes down to a central focus on the papacy and the institutions that go along with that. There's a magisterial teaching office that largely controls the details of the faith throughout the communion. It allows for a significant amount of diversity within Roman Christianity, but there's a greater emphasis on a unity of that kind of faith and a more hierarchical structure for the entire global Roman Catholic Church. That's really not the case for the Anglican Communion. As I've said, it's a group of churches that exist in community with one another. And so we're going to talk about the possibilities for that and how that works. To do that, we're going to go back to the really to the 18th century to pick up on a few things that happened. And I've noted that in this cleverly titled slide called Some Things That Happened. Oh, and now that I've written circles on stuff, I don't know how to erase them since I've never used that tool before. Yeah, there we go. Okay.
Learning experience, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's nothing like learning on the job. Um, so we're thinking about the development of the Anglican Communion, which is different than talking about the creation of the Anglican Communion. That is, the Anglican Communion was not created by any body or group of people that sat down in a room somewhere and said, what do we do? What does this church look like? What are the shapes and structures of it? Does anybody have any ideas? And somebody in the back raised their hand and said, what about a communion? It's something that really developed out of the specific character of English Christianity and is a kind of an outgrowth of the colonial spread of that form of Christianity over the earth. So we're going to address some of the ecclesial and political realities of that in a moment. But the first thing that we want to do is we want to note three interrelated realities that are reshaping the church and the world. And when I say that they are reshaping the church and the world, it's because these are things that happened 200-300 years ago. The initial ideas, understandings, developments took place in the 18th and 19th century, but they still influence us. They still shape and reshape the form of church, the form of Christianity, both in the Anglican Communion and outside of the Anglican Communion. Those things are basically this. In the 1700s is when this really took off. There comes a rise of critical theological scholarship. Theological because it started with the biblical texts, with the emphasis on that in the Protestant Reformation. It suddenly became much, much more important to know what the scriptures said and what those scriptures meant. Prior to the Protestant Reformation, if you needed to know the answer to those things, then you had the Roman Catholic Church and its magisterium that could provide the answers for that. So there was a much stronger role for the church to play in kind of dictating or interpreting the nature of the faith. With the Protestant Reformation, the idea was to go back to the Bible alone. And in going back to the Bible alone, it became significantly more important for the Bible to be a source that we could have absolute confidence in. And that's where questions about the accuracy of the text, about how that text was transmitted to us, about whether or not we have the true scriptures available to us became much, much more important. And the study of those texts opened up the path to recognizing that amongst the hundreds and thousands of manuscripts that we had, the biblical manuscripts that we had, there were significant textual variants within those that needed to be we had to figure out what to do with those variants, why those things mattered, or how to overcome that variant, because it changes the nature of doctrine and church teaching in certain places, depending on which reading we're using. That's not a new idea. The church fathers, when you go back to the second and third centuries, they're aware of this because they just have hand copied manuscripts. They know which one they had available to them. They know that the church down the road holds a different manuscript. They know the different readings of those things. And so they're working to kind of arbitrate between those differences. In the 18th century, that arbitration takes on a much deeper and more scientific study. And I'm using the word scientific there to mean that it becomes kind of a critical study. It's a point of asking, how do we as humans decide what the actual scriptural text is? As they're asking those questions, it is putting humanity into a new relationship with Scripture, because the Scriptures no longer. Let me see. Excuse me. I'm trying to keep up on the chat here. Is a message from Wendith. So as they're asking questions and they're sifting through these textual variants, they begin to become aware of other issues and concerns within these scriptures as they've been passed down to us. Those concerns lay primarily in terms of, or at least initially, in terms of the authorship of some of these texts. That is, did Moses actually write all 5 books of the Pentateuch, which is what tradition would have us believe? Did Isaiah write all of the books of, all of Isaiah? What is the date of these things? When it comes to the Pentateuch, what we understand now, or what we kind of accept now, is modern scholarship would say that the 5 books of Moses, as they were once called, and still are in some places, were most likely the product of significant revision, representing different concerns, influences, and interests at different periods within Israelite history that leads to different ways of understanding what those books actually are. When they were written, it makes a big difference if they were written, in 1500 BC, or if they were written after the return of the exiles, when they were edited. And then the other thing that comes along with that is dates relating to things that can be sort of pinpointed within Scripture. When did the creation of the earth take place? For Bishop Ussher, in writing in the 1500s, he calculates it back. He adds up all the genealogies. He anchors those genealogies against dates that we can know for certain. The exiles returned from Babylon in 586 BC. You can work your way back from that and come up with a date for the creation of the earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's Adam and Eve. You know how old Adam was when he has kids. You know how old the kids are when they have kids. You do the math and you figure it out. And so if you have a King James Bible, and we may talk about this a little bit more detailed in another one of these classes, I'm not sure yet. But if you go back and look in your King James Bible, in the apparatus that sits in the middle of them, if it's old enough, and when I say old enough, I mean like 50 years. It doesn't have to be that old. I've got a number of these Bibles that have that. It says 4004 BC, because that's the date that Bishop Ussher calculated as the date of creation. We're going to talk about this in a minute. Scientific understanding at the time that they're doing this is really starting to undermine the idea of an earth that's only 4,000 years old. Another date that the Bible gives is the census that's taken at the time of Jesus's birth. And so people are looking at that. We have records of these censuses. We know when they were called. We know who called them and what happened. And there wasn't one that happened right then. And so people begin to ask questions about that sort of thing. They begin to ask questions about the geography of the Bible because Mark doesn't know the geography of the Holy Land. He talks about going up to some place when the only way to get there from where he was would have been to have gone down. It calls into question who this person actually was, what they knew, whether or not they actually walked with and traveled with Jesus. As they're studying this, they're also encountering this idea that the Greek that the New Testament was written in, which we know as Koine Greek, there's a new understanding of what that is because the Koine Greek doesn't align with classic, or I believe it's called Attic Greek. David would know this much, much better than I am because he's the language scholar. There's a difference between the Greek of the Bible and the Greek that's used in many other Greek texts that we have. And the belief for many, many years, and at least this is what I was taught in the more conservative denomination that I grew up in. Not conservative, they weren't. The more traditionalist congregation church that I grew up in was that this language was a special form of Greek that God gave to the authors of the Bible as he dictated it, right? And then over time, we actually found out that it was simply the everyday language of the Greek speaking peoples. That there was a formal Greek language that people would write in if they wanted to appear erudite and scholarly. And then there was the language that people spoke in. And if Greek was your second language, and if it wasn't a particularly strong language for you, which again is the case in the author of Mark's gospel, then it changes how people came to view and understand the Bible. The Bible itself became a place that was contested. It couldn't be viewed any longer as something that dropped down from on high. What grew out of that was what was called the quest for the historic Jesus, because all of this began to call some of the teachings of the Gospels into question. There are certainly points where the Gospels are in conflict with one another, and there are places where the Gospels are obviously interpreted documents. And so scholarship is going back and they're saying, well, these Gospels, these New Testament documents point us to Jesus, but I'm not entirely sure that they're accurate histories that include, word for word what Jesus had to say. And the point of all that is simply to say that starting around 1750 and moving into our contemporary time, much of what had been simply taken for granted in terms of the understanding of the church about who God was, how God communicated to God's people, what it meant to be Christian, was wildly and radically changed as a result of these innovations in understanding about the nature of the Bible, about the person and nature of Jesus. At the same time that is going on, there are innovations that are happening within the sciences. The first one of those is what we call the Copernican revolution, when we move from a geocentric understanding of the solar system to a heliocentric one. That is the idea that the Earth is at the center of everything that God has created. And again, you go back to Genesis and you read this account. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So the earth is the first thing that's formed. And after that, it's the stars and the sun and things like that. And the implication is there and in other places that the sun revolves around the earth. The sun rises and it sets. I mean, this is poetic language that we find in the Psalms and other parts of the Old Testament. Um, all of those things begin to be overturned scientifically. And then we start finding other planets. We start figuring out that this is actually revolving around the sun. And what happens in the next instance, well, and then the other thing that happens is the age of the Earth gets pushed back further and further and further because as geologists are doing their work, as people are beginning to discover the fossil record and things like that, in order to account for all of these changes and differences, they need more time. And so there's this process. And so the culmination of this really shows up in 1859 with Darwin's Origin of Species, that proposes the idea of natural selection as an evolutionary process by which organisms change from one form to another given enough time. And what that does is it decenters the earth from the center of the universe as God's, special creation. It decenters humanity as God's special creation within the range of creation. And that causes profound religious disturbances within the church. What happens then within the church is many, many, many people reject that. So I grew up in another denomination that it's kind of the independent, more conservative branch or offshoot of the Disciples of Christ. So all of this stuff they would reject. The idea of critical theological scholarship, the idea of evolution, natural selection, things like that. To this day, they still reject those things. I even knew people who rejected the heliocentric vision of the universe. What happens then for other communities, and this is what happens within the Church of England, within the broader Anglican communion, is they begin to integrate theology and science. There are key areas that privilege science and critical scholarship. And where this takes place in English Christianity is in a work called Essays and Reviews. It was written in 1860, so it was published 4 months after Darwin, and it sold more copies in 2 years than Darwin's Origin of Species sold in 20 years, which should give you some kind of sense of how influential and important this was. It was written primarily by prominent clergy, and it takes up all of these issues that I've kind of introduced here. It talks about Old Testament prophecy, and it says that it wasn't. The sort of thing that we hear in our Christmas sermons now, that when Isaiah points and says the virgin will be with child, he's not talking about Mary. He's talking about, a young woman who's sitting there while he's speaking. It's something it's undermining the accounts of the miracles that we hear in the scripture. It's undermining the cosmology that Moses offers in the Pentateuch, or the authors of the Pentateuch offer, where the earth is at the center of the creation. It rereads the 39 articles to be much more open, and it includes some radical ideas at the time about the proper way to read and interpret the Bible. Now, some of you are sitting there thinking, wait a minute, I thought we were talking about the Anglican communion and its structure and constitutions and canons and things like that. We are. This is partly why we're talking about those things, because the shape of the church, the nature of Christianity, the way that we think about the faith is undergoing radical and profound changes during this 200, 300 year period of time. And these are changes that are not over yet. What we're going to see tonight is that the issues that are brought up out of this are still ongoing issues of contention, not just within, say, fundamentalist churches like the one that I grew up in, but within the Anglican communion itself. And the way that we're going to talk about that is through something that's kind of known as the Colenso affair. Um, John William Colenso was consecrated Bishop of the South African Diocese of Natal in 1853. This is a newly formed diocese. So he's the first bishop of this diocese. As it's newly formed, it also indicates that it comes about through the colonial expansion of the British Empire. And so Colenso is appointed by the crown to go down to South Africa to enter this diocese and to establish the Anglican church there, the Church of England there. Now, Colenso is a student of this kind of theological thinking, the kind of theological thinking that we've been talking about. And he publishes several books that question the historic accuracy of the Pentateuch, particularly in regard to Mosaic authorship, that question the history of the book of Joshua, and that also offers a universalist interpretation of the book of Romans. So he's working to undo the ideas of eternal damnation and things like that. He is a student and a friend of Frederick Denison Maurice, who's one of the great theologians of the Anglican tradition. And he is advocating for an understanding of culture that suggests that the revelation of God is already present among non-Christian people. And he supports local customs and forms of morality. This is, again, a deeply controversial position. We'll start with his approach to, I went too far there, with his approach to other nations and other peoples. One of his writings, he says this: the issue is not whether the Zulu nation, so these are the people that he's working with, the Africans that he's working with. The issue is not whether the Zulu nation could benefit from European civilization and the Christian religion, but whether Europe and Christianity might benefit from what the Zulus had to give them. Think about how radical that statement is in a colonizing endeavor. Okay? The colony is bringing to these people the European civilization and the Christian religion. It's doing so under the ideas that flow out of the doctrine of discovery, which is a Roman Catholic doctrine that we've talked about a great deal in our diocese. If you're if you're part of leadership in the Diocese of Northern Michigan, you have to do training about that, right? It grows out of those kinds of ideas that the Western European nations are there for the purpose. They have been ordained by God to go out into all the world and to convert other people to civilized European values and to Christian understandings. So his views on the Bible and Christianity are controversial enough on their own, but then he's advocating this understanding of humanity itself that is wildly out of step with colonial and also out of step with evolutionary understandings of humanity. Because as the kind of evolutionary ideas are being sort of spread around, and Darwin isn't the first person to talk about hierarchies of animals, plants, cultures, things like that. As the Western European nations go through all the earth, they start to develop hierarchies of cultures. They start to think about and ask questions. Well, did God actually create just one race out of Adam and Eve? How is it possible to see this much human diversity from simply one creation of one couple? And so they think, well, maybe there's actually multiple races that God created, or sort of multiple Adams and Eves. Colenso is really undermining that. And what he says is this, well, he didn't say this, is kind of my paraphrase, but the linkage among different people groups is not their faith in the first instance. That is, what connects us as people is not, oh, all of you are Christian, therefore you are the same kind of people. But what connects people is their common humanity. And he suggests that humanity itself is now blessed and redeemed in Christ. Okay. So again, this is powerful, powerful teaching that humanity itself, something happens in the Christ event that blesses and redeems humanity. And that blessing and redemption actually transcends understandings of religion, church, baptism, whatever you want to talk about. His goal as bishop was to establish an African kingdom with an African church, with African bishops and African clergy. This is wild, wild stuff. Now, people back home didn't like that. So that's where this kind of gains its notoriety. There's one issue. All of this other stuff here, right, that we talked about in terms of the theological, cultural, social understandings of the church. You can kind of find these in other places. He's within is the cutting edge of theology. But there's a tremendous amount of conflict that revolves around these things. So he's already set himself up as a lightning rod theologically. But then socially, morally, and kind of religiously, he has some other suggestions that that also change and create a tremendous amount of conflict. In 1855, so after he's been bishop for 2 years, he has been working in this African area, and he writes a book to go along with his biblical works. The name of the book is this: Remarks on the Proper Treatment of Cases of Polygamy Converts from Heathenism. Okay? Because within this part of Africa, polygamy is a common practice. So you have one man with multiple wives. And what he does is he advocates for the toleration of polygamy. He's personally not in favor of it, but in the interest of what it means to be church in this place, he says the church must tolerate this because that is the cultural practice. And he recommends that we should baptize practicing polygamists, though he doesn't want them to keep getting married or add additional wives after they've been baptized. He says this: the price of conversion to Christianity should never be the dissolution of the family and perhaps the destitution of wives and children. And so he's approaching this issue in this way because of what happens when you demand within this polygamous system, what happens when one man and one woman, when that system is imposed upon a polygamous culture where that idea is foreign. Let me see if I can pause this for just a minute. So to kind of pause here for a minute, this is still an ongoing issue. There's literally nothing that we're talking about tonight that isn't still in some way, shape, or form a contemporary issue within the Anglican communion, within worldwide Christianity. One of the formative experiences of my life was I had some friends, still do, within my denomination of origin who were missionaries in Zimbabwe. So just adjacent to South Africa, similar cultures, similar social, religious practices. They go over there as missionaries. They're sent out from this traditionally minded church that has fairly fundamentalist kinds of beliefs about human sexuality, about what marriage is, and things like that. They go over there and they encounter these people who are married to multiple wives. The practice of the church, say 120 years ago, 150 years ago, was to demand the separation from the extra wives, for lack of a better term. Um, what happened when they did that is the other wives became destitute because the only way to support themselves was to, I mean, in that culture, was through the protection of a man. Um, they would turn to prostitution typically. The children are in trouble because they're not getting food. So it creates these very immediate and obvious problems when the church comes in and makes those sort of demands on people. Now, in my denomination, this was still like an ongoing issue, right? The missionaries are trying to figure out what to do. Now, the missionaries that I was friends with are good, good people. And they were smart enough to recognize the implications of that. And so they come to the same conclusion that Colenso does 150 years later. And they say, we will not allow this practice of marriage, this socially constructed practice of marriage, to stand in the way of a person's conversion to Christianity. We will baptize them into the church. They will be full Christians. These are still ongoing issues. Now, they don't come back to America and broadcast that because that's a fast way to not have funding for your mission. Okay. Like there's still controversial issues here. Um, when the news of this gets back to England, there is a deep, deep scandal. Okay. The books that he's writing, the way in which he's conducting himself in this diocese, his privileging of the Zulu people, and the desire to have them leading the church creates a tremendous amount of conflict within the Church of England and within the other Anglican churches throughout the world, the people that are aware of this. In 1865, Colenso was excommunicated for heresy by Robert Gray, who was the Archbishop of Cape Town. Now, in response to this excommunication, Colenso says, "Thank you, but no, I'm not interested in being excommunicated." And so he
right.
appealed to the Privy Council, which is part of the legal system within England. He appealed to them because, as Bishop of Natal, he had not been appointed by Robert Gray, the Archbishop of Cape Town. He had been appointed bishop by the crown. He had been sent out by the English crown, which was the case for almost the majority of missionary clergy and bishops in the British colonies until fairly recent times. The clergy were people who came from England. And again, it's an ongoing process. It's not been that long ago that was still happening. So when I did one of my degrees at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. The person that I studied with was an English. He held dual status in the Church of England and in the Scottish Episcopal Church as a priest. But in the 1970s, when he was first ordained, he spent some time as a missionary priest in India because that was one of the ways that you kind of gained some training and experience was you went overseas to do some missionary work in a colony or in a former colony. For Bishop Colenso, it was this legal process rather than the ecclesial one that saved him. And what I'm trying to do, again, you're probably saying, how does this have anything to do with structures, with church canons, and things like that? It necessitated them. It called them into being, these structures. And again, this is a presenting issue. He did not do this by himself. There were numerous examples, usually in smaller ways, numerous things that the church couldn't figure out how to resolve. because they didn't know who had the authority or the ability to resolve it. Um, it was the Church of England wasn't modeled after the Roman Church, where all certain kinds of absolute authority were invested in the Archbishop of Canterbury. They didn't develop other forms of authority that would have that kind of binding legislative um, implications for a circumstance like this. So what you have here, and that it comes together very neatly, which is why I'm talking about this guy. What you have here is a situation where the doctrine that is, the shape of Christianity is being undermined by, or the received doctrine of the church is being undermined by this person who's calling into question the received tradition that nobody else has questioned about authorship and dating and the historicity of these books, who's calling into question basic tenets of human sexuality that the church has spent a tremendous amount of time and energy trying to uphold. And all of that is wildly decentering. Um, for those of you that care about such things, the way that this turned out, the Archbishop of Cape Town consecrated an extra bishop for Natal, sent him up there to carry out his work. So you had two bishops in this one province for about 10 years. Colenso remained the sort of legally, technically, functionally correct bishop in that place. But it creates this conflict and confusion because how do you determine who's in charge of the church in South Africa if you're appealing to somebody that is an entire continent away, or to a group of people who are an entire continent away, who aren't familiar with what's happening in that place, who don't know how to legislate, and who are very not that they don't know, but who refuse to do that. So, what do we do, or what does the church do, and how does it respond? Well, the way it responds is in 1865, Colenso is excommunicated for heresy. In 1867, the first Lambeth Conference was held in September. All right. This was held not just because of the challenges presented by Colenso. In fact, the bishop who called that, Bishop Longley, I think Charles Longley, I believe was his name, the bishop who called that conference explicitly avoided the appearance of legislating on these issues. And when the other people attending that conference attempted to bring that into the proceedings, he worked to go around it so that they did not issue a binding determination on the questions surrounding Colenso, which is a practice that more or less continues to this day. The first Lambeth Conference, an invitation was sent to all the bishops that were associated with what we now call the Anglican Communion. So again, they're calling them out from the various colonies and former colonies of the English crown, the places where the church has spread by missionary activity, and so on and so forth. And they show up in Lambeth in England to talk about what it means to be the church, and to do so in a way they're trying to clarify acceptable doctrinal parameters without legislating narrow doctrinal decrees. And they're trying to figure out how these different churches can relate to one another as church. And this is the basic approach to unity throughout the communion that's maintained to this day. And the way that is maintained globally is through what's called the four instruments of unity. And these are designed to the extent that they are designed, because one of them, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is something that goes back to 597 AD when Gregory the Great sends uh, Augustine of Canterbury to Christianize the British Isles, right? Isn't that archbishopric isn't designed to do anything other than being an archbishop? The status of that archbishop changes at the English Reformation, and that person becomes elevated to a primacy of honor, but not really of authority. That is, he doesn't hold, or she, I suppose, could be. This person does not hold authority that goes beyond their office of Archbishop of Canterbury, which is the primate, that is, the primary bishop of the Church of England. So that instrument is not designed to do anything other than be the archbishop. But in the context of the Anglican Communion, the Archbishop of Canterbury is a connecting point. If we are in fellowship with the Archbishop of Canterbury, then it means that we are in fellowship with the church in South Africa, because they are in fellowship with the Archbishop of Canterbury. We're in fellowship with the Church of South India because they are in fellowship with the Archbishop of Canterbury. Like, that's how that is designed, or that's how it's kind of intended or used or spoken about, to think about the structure of the Anglican Communion and how we relate to one another. The Lambeth conferences, as I said, we're kind of the next global structure to emerge. The first one was in 1867. They meet roughly every 10 years or so. Some of them 12, some 15, but more or less that's when they meet. So there's been 15 of them in the last 160 some odd years. And what they do is, this is a gathering of all the bishops of the church are invited to discuss significant issues facing the communion. They may issue resolutions that reflect the general sense of the communion, but those resolutions are not legislatively binding. That is, they do not have any legal or binding authority. They're simply there to say, this is what we as a group of bishops came up with. The next instrument that arises doesn't show up for another 100 years. In 1968, the Anglican Consultative Council was formed. That's a significant date because that coincides with the decade after really the last vestiges of the British Empire are dissolved, or at least the last really major vestiges of it. The Anglican Consultative Council is unique amongst the four instruments of unity in that it's the only one that has a constitution. It's the only one that is not limited to bishops. It's made up of lay people, clergy, and bishops together, and it prioritizes the voice of, to some degree, of lay people. In small provinces, if you don't have enough people to send, then the remit is to send the laity first. And what the Anglican Consultative Council is designed to do is to share information among the provinces, to advise on Anglican relations and issues, and to develop missional responses and strategies to circumstances throughout the globe. So later in this course, we're going to talk about the 5 marks of mission. Some of you may be familiar with that. Hopefully you are if you're not. But it comes out of, the 5 marks of mission come out of the Anglican Consultative Council in 1984. And it's one of the things that has really received pretty global assent amongst the churches of the Anglican Communion. If you look at the web page of almost any of the provinces, of the Anglican Communion, they're going to mention the five marks in there someplace because it's become an important mark or characteristic of what it means to be Anglican. Like I said, when we get to the session on mission, we'll go back and talk about that a little bit more. And then you have the primates meeting, which is the most recent gathering. And it's the picture that I have here. I think the most recent one was maybe 2022, if I'm remembering correctly. And these are just regular meetings of the 38 primates. That is the people like Michael Curry, who leads national provincial churches. They all gather every 2 to 3 years to talk about issues facing the wider communion. If you look at this picture, you'll notice the diversity of peoples and a little teensy bit of diversity of gender. I think there's one woman here. Again, this wouldn't have been the case 160, 160 years ago. 1867 Lambeth, everybody's white. So it's what we want to kind of note here is that the way that we talk about ourselves, the way we think about ourselves is changing, is becoming more and more diverse, more and more culturally different. And there are more and more voices being brought into these spaces. This is the Anglican Communion really at the global level. And what is significant about this is that in all of these instruments of unity, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lambeth Conferences, the Anglican Consultative Council, and the Primates meeting, none of these have any legislative authority. None of them can say anything that is binding on the constituent member churches, which is really an astounding thing to think about. If you have a global church that is run by people who cannot tell the church how to run itself, then the question is, how does such a church function? And the way that it functions is there's a movement from the global to the local. So this is all, again, this is all really by either wisdom, accident, or design that has kind of worked together to create a unique ecclesiology within just Christianity in general. There aren't a lot of other churches of this size and scope that function in this way, gathering together regularly to kind of discuss and then to go back and to sit with what they talked about and to then make decisions, binding decisions at the local level. So the Anglican Communion operates under a principle, and I'll say this too, the Episcopal Church operates under a principle that prioritizes local decision-making over top-down control. And which probably sounds kind of funny, depending on what your experience has been with the apparatus of the church. And it may sound kind of funny going into General Convention, where there's a lot of legislative talk and discussion and ferment. But at the level of an ideal, and sometimes at the level of actual practice, this is how we want to function. The priority is first of all at the congregational, then at the diocesan, then at the provincial, and then the global level. And it's in that order because there is a recognition that different cultural circumstances need different Christian responses. And if you think about that just in terms of, for those of you that have traveled throughout the US, that have been in the Episcopal Church in different dioceses, different places, those of you in the UP that have moved between congregations, every place has a different character, a different theological function, a different approach to liturgy, a different way of just sort of being Christian in that place, a different way of responding to moral and social issues. Within that, we recognize the need for consultation, for advice and direction on issues that affect the entire communion so that everybody doesn't simply run around doing as they wish. And so the ideal is to create unity out of diversity. And the thing that's being argued about, or the thing that's difficult, is to figure out what the limitations are on that diversity, and to try to figure out how to create unity within groups of people that may not agree about much at all, or may not agree about some very specific examples. So I said, for example, that the issues that I was raising with Bishop Colenso, that these are still with us. They are, because when you look at if you look at this picture, like I said, there's a change in gender here, and I believe the woman, I can't remember her name. I think she was the primate of oh, is it Canada or New? Anyway, there's a change there. Not everybody recognizes the role and function of women as priests, much less as bishops. That's not just an issue in the Anglican Communion, it's an issue within the Church of England. When I was over there a couple years ago, we talked to women priests who could not function in certain congregations within the Diocese of London because their authority as priest was not particularly welcomed. It was maybe tacitly acknowledged, but it wasn't seen as something that was morally right for the church. The issues that are presented in Colenso show up every time there are questions about gender, every time there are questions about marriage, in relation to same-sex couples and things like that. They're the same kinds of issue. And what happens in those is, for example, the recent conflict, we're now 25 years, give or take, into tremendous conflict within the Anglican Communion over same-sex couples, whether or not how they can be within the church, what they can do, how they can function. It was brought to a head by the ordination of Gene Robinson in America, and there was in Vancouver in the Anglican Church of Canada. They also began to bless and welcome same-sex couples. Okay, those things became very, very deep issues, and the pushback came from a number of churches that have their roots in colonial missionary activities, because the more conservative evangelical parts of the Church of England were the ones that went out and did the missionary work. The pushback comes against the homosexual union on that side, and from within the church in the United States, we're still looking at the issue of polygamy, and we're saying, hey, that's not right either, right? I mean, so everybody involved is still arguing about these fundamental ideas and notions of human sexuality. What we want to see then is that authority is something that is both global and local. It's something that is both formal in the sense that we have locally created constitutions and canons. We have the one for our diocese. We have one for the United States Church. So it's formal in that way, and it's informal because it still relates to the relationships that we have with one another. Like if Rayford is the bishop of the Diocese of Northern Michigan, if all that he did was walk around hitting people with his cannon stick, right? Pretty soon you're going to get tired of that and say, well, no, I've had enough. And so if the bishop of a diocese wants to get something done, then she or he has to develop the relationships that are necessary to accomplish that. In the same way, if somebody wants to accomplish something at the local level, it has to happen relationally. You can build all the structures and write all the laws you want, but if it's not something that happens in fundamental relation and communion with one another, it's not likely to happen. So at the global level, the Anglican Communion functions primarily, it relates to itself, it constitutes itself, primarily through informal and relational mechanisms. Like the structure of Anglicanism is fundamentally relational and communal. It's the Anglican communion that we talk about, not the Anglican church, right? We're signifying up front that there's a bunch of us. Authority is something that's dispersed among many different voices and influences that work together to create unity within diversity. And while at the global level, there's little that formally binds the communion together, there's a great deal of informal power and authority that's wielded because we have committed ourselves to listen to the moral leadership of Justin Welby, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury, of Michael Curry, who is the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in North America, for one more week. We listen to Rayford Ray or whoever our bishop is. And when all of these bishops get together and talk, or in the case of the Anglican Consultative Council, when representatives of all the provinces get together to talk, we want to listen, right? That's really the structure of it, is we want to exist in communion with one another. And it's a communion that fundamentally goes back to our baptismal theology. The question then, and this is our last slide, we're going to open up some time for discussion on the readings and this material. The question then is this, or this is what this looks like at the local level and how this is put into practice. The question is what it means to be church. At the local level, the structure changes to become much more legislative, and this is defined in the constitution and canons of each province and each diocese. All right. There are elements of our common history that are evidenced here. If you look at these are the canons for ordination. And I picked this out not because I think that's a particularly important or constitutive part of the church, but because it's actually one of the places where it's easiest to see these local differences, because this is spelled out in legal language. There's legislative structure here. The bishop and the commission shall work to develop. Like, shall is a legal word. You must do this. I'm looking at the top on the left-hand side. They shall work with the postulant or candidate to develop and monitor a program of preparation for ordination to the priesthood. Okay, so there's something that has to happen here. But then as we read on to what has to happen, when we get into the parameters of what's spelled out here, what needs to happen? Well, if they've not previously obtained a baccalaureate degree, what needs to happen? Not that they have to get such a degree, but that we'll design a program of additional academic work as may be necessary. The program of study is not legislated. The idea of study is legislated. Like, does that distinction make sense? I mean, the same thing. The formation takes into account the local culture, prior education, learning from life experience is considered. And then we get into what they need to be studying. The Holy Scriptures, the history of the Christian church, Christian theology, Christian ethics and moral theology, Christian worship, according to the use of the Book of Common Prayer, the hymnal, authorized supplementary text, the practice of ministry and mission, and so on and so forth. But it is not at all legislated how that has to happen. And if you're in the diocese in Northern Michigan, and some of you are taking this course in order to prepare for ordination, some of you in order to prepare for joining an MST, some of you for your own good pleasure, and God bless all of you for sitting through this. Okay, what happens is we read that and we said, oh, that there is no place in this work that describes a seminary education. We will do our formation. We will accomplish this, but we will do it according to our practices and our habits. And the church allows that to happen because we are living within the actual legality of the canon, which says what must happen, but not how it's going to happen. Okay? I hope that makes sense.
I wish that the entire communion would understand that.
I do too, because I've had some negative experiences with parts of it that don't. That's
Amen.
yeah.
And it's here in the church in the United States.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, again, I've had negative experiences. I know more people than I can count that have. And I also have had really positive experiences with churches that are, interpreting it along the lines of what I'm suggesting here. Honestly, that's a good place to stop. And I want to make sure we have some time for you guys to talk. I'm sorry, I talked a little bit longer than I thought I would. The problem with teaching these classes in one-off ways is I don't always know how long things are going to take. So with that, I'm going to stop. I want to open it up for conversation around what we've talked about and around the readings that I sent out last week, because those readings are hopefully significant and helpful background information to flesh out what I was talking about here tonight. So.
Well, Brad, I don't see a raise hand function on my particular screen right now. You hear me? Yeah, okay. I did not have the time to read through all of those documents, but I did start with the, get what the title is now. But anyway, the historical background of the Constitution and canons, and how they are similar and how they are different. And wow, that was really eye-opening, because as a former teacher, it's important that our young people and anybody who's in education knows not necessarily about the church kind of functions, although that's important too, but that there is historical background for where we're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just something that was kind of like, oh, something that's snatched out of the air. And, oh, well, this sounds good to me, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it, kind of thing. No, so I appreciate the readings that you offered to us, because I hope that I will have time to go back through those. But if I don't, then I still have the PowerPoint that you've created and the notes that I've taken to say, okay, so if somebody asks me a question, then I'm not really sure how to answer it, I can go back to those particular issues that are concerns of others.
Absolutely. And I'll note one thing, because we're going to come back to this probably in 2 sessions from now.
Okay.
It's not just that there are historical backgrounds for these documents. It's that the documents themselves develop. They change over time, and they're designed to change over time. And the practice of the church is, at one level, allowed to precede the changes within the canons. Because if the church can't change before the canons do, then how would the canons be changed? It's something that happens particularly in liturgy. It's something that's happened in terms of the ordination of women, in terms of the way that we deal with issues of sexuality and gender and things like that. Before those become canonical issues, they're first wrestled with at the local level. In a local church, that say there's a same-sex partnered couple begins going there. And, in the Episcopal Church, I mean, this has been going on for decades. And
it has been, yes.
So these changes are happening at local levels. They're figuring out what it means to be church within that environment. And then, given enough time and conversation about it, the canons themselves change. And they change very often to reflect a reality. Sometimes they change to reflect a reality that already exists, sometimes to create a future that is seen as desirable. I mean, there's two different ways for our canons to change and for the church to change and develop. And there may be more of somebody that's smarter than I am that's more familiar with the way that happens. But that's part of what goes on.
I could offer one other comment, and then I'll step down. Um, one of the similarities is that our United States Constitution also has a provision to amend the Constitution through the discussion with the Senate and the legislation bodies. And there have been significant constitutional amendments that have happened because of that. So there's, in my opinion, there still needs to be a way for cultures, uh, communities, and whatnot to say, hey, this doesn't really mesh with what we're dealing with right now in our community. But then you go down to the local government issue as well.
Right.
So, I mean, it seems like a good course to follow in terms of the process.
Mm-hmm.
Enough said for me.
Thank you, Susan. Any other comments, reflections?
I thought it was, this is Marion, I thought it was very interesting to read Stacy Saul's article again, because I lived through that as vice president of the province of the Midwest and meeting in provincial meetings when he was COO, and as a member of the executive council when he was COO. So it was very interesting to see the way it was presented in that letter and the way it was the way it was received and interpreted by Stacy himself when he was COO.
Indeed. And one of the things that we really want I want to make sure I highlight here, and I mentioned it, I think, in the email I sent out, but I want to mention it again. Part of the reason for looking at that is to see how these structures and these ideas inform the actual role and mission of the church. The mission of the church is not to create legislative bodies in order to govern itself. Those are not ends in and of themselves. The mission of the church is not to create a canon and constitutions in order to govern itself. That is not an end in and of itself. The mission of the church exists outside of the church, or it exists in a way that that those things are supposed to be supportive of, rather than to limit, and which I think is such an exciting thing about that work. Like I said, it's an outdated piece right now in terms of what he's actually talking about. But the idea that he's talking about is really a deeply profound one that we need to keep at the forefront of our mind. When we have to deal with these, wherever my copy is, when we have to deal with our Constitution and canons, we're dealing with something that in our mind, we need to think, how is this oriented towards the mission, towards accomplishing the work of the church, the goals that we have for speaking the gospel, for, promoting justice, for living into the 5 marks of mission that we're going to talk about by the end of the summer. That's what they're there to do. And if they're not doing that, then that's a problem. Or if there are people who are using them to prevent that from happening, then that's a problem. But a slightly different one than really what we're trying to talk about tonight. Other comments, questions, thoughts?
So listening to the segment on Bishop Colenso in South Africa, I couldn't help think of the one of the earliest fractures within the early Christian community, which was the dispute between Peter and the Judaizers and Paul and the Hellenists. And I think it's in Galatians where Paul confronts Peter and says, "Are we going to require the new Christians to be Torah observant and adhere to all of the demands of Leviticus and the various codes, including circumcision, or are we going to forego that because that's not their culture? Just like the Zulu people, that's not their culture. And do we have the right to step in and impose our mores and values onto the Hellenistic Christians?" It's very similar dispute.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and thank you for mentioning that because I've kept the conversation within the Anglican communion, and I've talked about these issues. Yeah, they're still with us, but the nature of the issue it goes back to the first century church. It's the issue that they had to deal with. How do we maintain unity in the actual encounter with diversity? The first Christian council is called to address that very issue. They gather in Jerusalem in Acts 15, and they try to figure out what do we actually need these people to do, and they provide an answer for it. Avoid food sacrifice to idols, which Paul later says you don't even have to do that. Avoid. I mean, there's four things that they come up with. None of them involve obeying the laws of these other people because they recognize that there are laws, not theirs. And so they create the ability to give permission to people to live as they are within the cultures in which they were born again. So yeah, thank you for that. Other comments? Well, with that, then I think we'll let things wrap up for the night. I appreciate it. Like I said, that's a little bit more lecture than I'd hoped to have. I'm sorry about that.
But Brad, this is Susan again. You've opened up a whole new window for me.
Oh, well, good.
I agree.
I
agree.
I really appreciate the perspective from which you are coming. And these are things that I've heard some things about, but the Colenso affair was nothing I had ever heard about before. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, I mean, he's a good lens because everything's right there. Like he and of himself didn't cause that to happen, but it illustrates what we wanted to be about. There are a lot of things that we can talk about in terms of governance and structure within the Episcopal Church. What we do tonight doesn't hope to cover that. I would encourage you take a look at the Constitution and canons, read through them, skim through them, find the parts that are interesting, be observant, in how our dioceses are structured and all of these things, and be aware that there's freedom within this if we're in a situation that we can get it. Yeah. That's us for tonight. Thank you, folks, so very, very much.
Are you going to Louisville?
Yes, I am.
Excellent.
So I think I'm heading out Friday. Is anybody else here going to be there? I believe Wendeth is.
I think Wendeth is on her way from what she inserted into the chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
I will not be there, but we have someone from our end of the UPA who is. So
Yeah.
I think Jen will be there.
Yeah, Jen will
Yeah.
be there.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, we'll get together July 2nd and I'll go, oh, everything was wrong. I've experienced this.
I
Is this your first convention?
Yeah, it is.
yes,
Yeah. So
and
it'll
first
be interesting to see.
Bergsma as well, first convention.
Mhm.
So
Okay.
So our next plan, we're going to meet on July 2nd. We're going to talk about Anglican spirituality, which is a little bit closer to home for probably most of us, because that's our main thing. So July 2nd, I'm still going to be in Indiana for a few days because my folks live, we've got a home about an hour outside of Louisville. So I'll be coming from there and look forward to seeing everyone then. So,
Okay.
Brad, could you shoot me the readings? For some reason, I didn't receive them.
yeah, certainly.
And make sure I'm on the email list. I
Yeah, I'll
got
double check
your
that.
mailing from June 5th. That
Okay.
came through, but not for this session.
Okay, I apologize
Yeah,
then.
that's all right.
Yeah,
That's all right.
So these lists, I send out the thing and everybody signs up, and so I've got like a master list, and then other people ask to be added, and I don't even know what's going on. So
yeah,
anyway,
I hear that.
all right. Have a
All
good
right.
night,
Thank
folks.
you. Great
But-
stuff. Yep.
Bye.
Have a good evening, Brad, and everybody else.
Yep. You too.
Take care.
Thanks.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.
Bye now.